market of comic books, manga, manhwa, webtoons, etc. is oversaturated. I mean, come on, even you can admit that villainess plots, OP protagonists, isekais, and superhero fantasy kind of stories are a bit overdone, you know, a bit too explored, if you understand what I mean. So comic creators need to be a bit more creative. They need to find ways to improve their craft, and readers need to know how to find stuff that isn't the same old. But it's hard for the average Joe to know how to find something that's not boring, more immersive, actually more engaging is the word I'm looking for. That's why I want to use this video to explain what I found in my psychological experiment. Yes, I'm that girl. That shows how the comic itself and the reader themselves influences our reading experience, and how that information can be taken and applied to comic creators, readers, and reviewers, and inform them on how to better partake in this wonderful medium that we all enjoy. You know, reading comics is slay. I mean, I stay up all night reading Hush, reading Surundere Children, and I don't know, Omniscient Reader. You know, I love comics. I love reading different types of comics, and so I want to improve the medium, and hopefully this video will help us to improve the medium as best as we can on an individual basis. And if you've got time, read ABENI'S Army. She's waiting for you. So let's get started. First of all, what did this study assess? What was the methods? How did we figure out the information we need to know so that we can improve this wonderful medium? Well, this study assessed whether visual abstraction, the process of reducing people into iconic representations of themselves, basically just going ooga booga, let's make this complex image into a stick man, and comic exposure, self-reported exposure to comics. I mean, do I have to explain just how many times you've read a comic? Influenced emotional engagement, which is emotion recognition accuracy, emotion categorization, and narrative immersion. That's right, we looked into whether visual abstraction and comic exposure influenced emotional engagement with comics. You follow me? You following? Now, let's be realistic. How many participants do you think I actually got for this study? Yeah, that's right. I got 129. Yeah, I got 129. I was ecstatic. I'm sure you could tell. It's very difficult to recruit people, trust me. Imagine if someone just texted you and say, hey, you want to do this study for no pay, for an endless amount of time, XYZ. They're not going to say yes. So I had to pull out the big guns. And by big guns, I mean So back to seriousness, yeah. 129 participants took an adjusted version of the fictional media exposure test. This study was, by the way, supervised by Rebecca Chamberlain, who connected me with Casey Graywill, and both of them are amazing. In this instance, Casey actually drew a study original comic. It was kind of like a slice of life, friends being reunited after a while, you know, and being reconnected. And so in this study, they would read, it was in a webtoon format, like a top to bottom reading format, and they would either read a highly abstract version of it, which is, you know, here, or they would read a medium abstract version of the comic, depending on the condition they were randomly allocated to. And yeah, so after that, they would take a related emotion recognition and categorization task. And so they, you know, you'd ask them, do they look happy? Do they look happy in this panel? And then you would either say yes, or you would say no, and then other stuff like, what kind of emotion do you think they were feeling, or blah, blah, blah. And yeah, so it would go along like that. And then they would lastly take a narrative immersion questionnaire with very detailed amount of items about transportation, identification, etc, 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 and do a debrief where I would either be like, do you need therapy, you know, was this harmful experience for you, you know, how do you feel? And then they would say like, yeah, I'm good, or they say no, I'm not. Now it's time for the findings. What did I find? What were the findings from these 129? I'm gonna keep saying that because my competitors, my rivals, got like half of that, and I'm proud of myself. So yeah, my 129 participants, yeah, what did they show me in the data? What did I find when stressing over the data? I still have nightmares about it now. Well, the first finding was that my first hypothesis was partially supported. So in this case, visual abstraction is a significant predictor of emotion categorization and recognition accuracy. So the differences in conditions kind of partially changed emotional engagement overall with the comic. This means that, you know, a simpler face or simpler construction of features in art, piece is easier to understand and relate to and engage with. And so, you know, exaggerated expressions and simpler expressions that are clearer to the reader are better for engagement, especially emotional engagement. And I don't mean that true beauty or grand blue kind of expressions are necessary. The idea is just that comic creators should focus on U-curved mouths, you know, and the placement of eyebrows on the face. Stuff like that can surprisingly affect overall engagement, as supported by other similar studies. That finding more relates to like when the comic creator is drawing a comic. The second finding similarly strokes my ego. Yes, hypothesis 2 was also partially supported. The comic fictional media exposure test scores, so the exposure scores, predicted emotion recognition accuracy. So depending on how many comics you are familiar with influences how engaged you were with the study's comic. Therefore, you know, the audience who's reading the comics are very important to take account of. This is again for more comic creators, I suppose, because individual differences in the audience members influences their engagement with a comic. So factors like familiarity with certain comic layouts, genres, story plots from the West or the East will affect overall engagement with fiction. TLDR, you read more comics, you're more critical of comics. The third finding does not stroke my ego, unfortunately. It leaves my ego dry, crying, abandoned, malnourished. That's because the third hypothesis was concerned about whether visual abstraction and comic exposure held hands to influence emotional engagement with comics. But in fact, they didn't. They broke up, they weren't friends, they don't even talk, bro. They don't even communicate. These three findings were the core findings of the study. But I do want to just say that you should take them with a grain of salt. Because first of all, this study is not without faults, you know. The stimuli was not naturalistic, and neither was the setting. You know, the stimuli was crafted specifically for this study, and so it cannot be a natural, realistic depiction of a normal comic. You know, it's not average. It was specifically created for it. The same way that the setting is not natural either, unless you're a weirdo and you usually like read a comic in a study. I don't think that ever happens. Usually people are, you know, lying down on their bed, or they're sitting in their chair and reading a comic casually, you know, on their computer listening to music. It's just not a naturalistic stimuli or setting. So the results of this study cannot be completely applicable to every situation. There were also exposure alternatives. So visual language fluency could have been used instead of comic exposure. They even had an index for it, and that could have better described the individual differences between comic readers who read comics, you know. And also just the visual language fluency concept is really nice, you know. It just suggests that every English speaker is not necessarily monolingual, you know, because we also have comic fluency. So if you're only speaking English and you're only fluent in English or native in English and you read comics, guess what? This just in, you're bilingual. It's just like a cute little thing to add to your, I guess, idea of yourself or your sense of self. I really like it, and I kind of regret not using it. So maybe in future studies it can be used as a way to measure individual differences. Who knows, it might have changed the results. There is a fourth result, a little add-on result that I think is important. It wasn't the point of this study, but it was something that I also measured that helped me to develop this channel in itself. So the fourth finding is about the narrative immersion questionnaire. It was based off of a dozen studies that were using different items and different statements to measure what narrative immersion is. And so I compiled this and I cut like half of them so that I can have a more succinct questionnaire that I made up. Then I used this kind of thing called factor analysis. It basically just sees whether the questionnaire measures what it's supposed to measure. Essentially, this questionnaire correlates well with itself and measures what it was intended to measure. Meaning that the questionnaire worked, and so even though visual abstraction or comic exposure didn't predict narrative immersion specifically, it can still be used as its own entity. And why would we use it as its own entity? Why would we use the narrative immersion questionnaire? Well, of course we need it for comic creators. If you want to create an interesting comic in this oversaturated market, then you need to make your comic more engaging, especially if you want to still use the same genres, still use the same tropes in your comics. And to make it more engaging, you need to look into narrative immersion. Use that questionnaire as you're creating your story to make sure that it is immersive enough, and focus on the subjective reading experience of your target audience. Adhere to your target audience. A great example is if you were making a superhero comic in Japan, you know, for a manga audience, then you wouldn't have much competition. Hence My Hero Academia is so popular. Whereas if you were making an isekai in the West, then you, again, the same thing would happen. But if you are making a superhero comic in the West, and if you're making an isekai in the East, in a manga format, then you actually do have to really boil down to try and make it more engaging. Exaggerate their expressions too. Then for readers, you know, readers can actually benefit from using the narrative immersion questionnaire quite seamlessly. When you're reading a comic, you know, you started a manga, you started a manhwa, started a, I don't know, just a random PDF file, something you saw online, like a 4-comma or something. While you're reading, you can start thinking about the different aspects of narrative immersion that are going on and whether you are satisfied with this. Is it doing what a lot of good, really solid quality stories do from the jump? Are they world building? You know, are they character developing? Are they setting up a good scene? If it's not, then chances are you're just getting enticed by the same old, and really it's not actually as unique as you might think, or it's not actually as interesting, and soon you'll get bored by the end of it. So instead of committing to, what's the opposite of a sleeper hit? The opposite of a sleeper hit, if you actually think and take a step back after a few chapters of reading something, and then, you know, actually consider whether they're hitting the mark, then I guarantee you won't have to suffer through reading 100 chapters or something and then realizing, oh wait, it's actually shit. And last but not least, reviewers. The narrative immersion questionnaire can be easily used to review any type of story that you want. I feel like I'm doing an ad. If you want to evaluate comics as a reviewer for the comic creator, you know, are you a beta reader for the comic creator? Or if you just want to do it on your own accord, you know, writing reviews on different websites and stuff for your own pleasure and your own satisfaction, then you can use the narrative immersion questionnaire in a more systematic way. If you want to know more about that, then watch my narrative immersion video. And that's how my studies results helps us all to improve the comic market, you know, how to better engage with it, how to better it as the creators themselves, and how to better review it. That is, yeah, that's all I got. If you like this video, then subscribe. Check out my other videos from anywhere. Just check out my channel, I don't know. And yeah, see you later. Have a nice day. I say a quirky goodbye right about now. Jannyeong. Jannyeong is a combination of Janne and Annyeong, because I am both a koreaboo and a weeaboo. Who would have thought? Nah, I'm not. I'm just a weeb. Janne, mata ne! このビデオは面白い。楽しかったです。でもね忘れた。それはバカですよ。最近ラブリーコンプレックス、日本語の名前は知らない。でも英語でラブリーコンプレックスを見ています。そしてこのアニメは勧めしたい。ラブリーコンプレックスは今までいいアニメ、とってもいいアニメ。進む。とにかくアンニョン。